Ali. On behalf of the World Bank, I would like to offer our prayers for the speedy recovery of the President Whip and thoughts with his family. I also wish to express my greatest and deepest respects to the Honorable Vice President, traditional leaders, ministers, cabinet members, ambassadors, development partners, media, community members, distinguished ladies and gentlemen. Before we jump into the presentation, I just wanted to express a sort of introduction of the World Bank in the North Pacific. We are the new kid on the block. So I just wanted to say a few words. For the first time ever, the World Bank has established a sub-regional office in the North Pacific. It's based in Pompeii, FSM, and though I've been tempted to move here, we are based in FSM. And it includes support to FSM, RMI, and Palau. The office was set up to strengthen our relationship and help the region to address critical development challenges. And our approach is to support the National Development Plan. And so we're pleased that the National Development Plan is going to be announced in the symposium today. The presentation that would be shared by the World Bank is a short symposium of data that was collected from various studies, and that is to give some inputs or some ideas on how to shape the development plan. And so without any more words, I'd like to pass you on to our colleague, David Gould, the lead economist and program leader for the World Bank. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Deji, and honored guests. This is a document that's designed for all of the Pacific countries that are listed on the bottom there. Kiribati, RMI, FSM, Nauru, Palau, Samoa, Tonga, Tuvalu, and Vanuatu. We refer to them as the PIC 9 countries. And what I've done here is pulled out the interesting data for Palau. It's really designed to be an interactive discussion, as opposed to the two other presentations we had from the ADB, the IMF, and the graduate school, which are more kind of near term. This is looking at more longer term structural development issues, and hopefully it can help you shape, your thinking about the National Development Plan and how you implement it going forward. So, why should we be interested in the systematic country diagnostic? Well, it provides somewhat of an outsider, insider view of Palau's development challenges going forward. So it's not just inward looking, but it's also outward looking. Allows for comparisons across the Pacific, so you get to see a bit about how Palau's challenges are related to other countries in the Pacific. Provides a foundation for us as development partners to best support Palau in its development objectives. And this seminar right here would help us provide very important feedback in modifying the report as we go forward. So, kind of skipping through a few slides here. So why the PIC 9 and why are we doing this systematic country diagnostic right now? Well, typically we do it every 4 years to help us strategize with the government about how the World Bank can fit in with other development partners in supporting its development program. It was last done in 2016, so it's been 6 years since our last diagnostic, and it's due for an update. Why do we have 9 countries grouped together? Well, there's similar characteristics to all the 9 countries. Number one, small population, small size, large oceans, of course, but they're also remote, and there's a lot of internal dispersion amongst the population. All these present development challenges for development in the Pacific. Secondly, there's a narrow economic base. Typically, you can define economic activity on 3 legs, right, in the Pacific. Number one, tourism, 2, fishing, and 3, agriculture. And then lastly, limited state capacity. Countries in the Pacific just have few people, which makes it difficult to really implement these large, complicated programs. So this is the current global context, but what I'm going to do is just talk about what has changed since 2016. Well, the most obvious thing is COVID-19, right? It's had significant economic impacts across the economic sectors, as we heard from the IMF and graduate school, particularly tourism and hospitality, very pertinent for Palau. It's affected progress on infrastructure projects and technical support. So the support that you would normally get from partners and your own investments in the country have been delayed by lack of travel, and it's also stretched fiscal balances. 2, it's increased the awareness of climate change. It's always been there. We've always known it even before the COVID crisis. But as we've seen with countries like Tonga, Fiji, and Vanuatu with cyclones, tsunamis, when you get hit, and you're getting hit with COVID and other health challenges, that just leads to more vulnerability. So resilience is one of the things that really we try to pull out of this report. Lastly, and this is more of a current impact, but it also will have implications over the time horizon in the next 4 years as we go through this new partnership with Palau and the other countries in the Pacific, is the greater uncertainty due to the Russia-Ukraine war and the global slowing, higher inflation, rising interest rates. And all that leads to is increasing global prices of commodities, as you all know, fuel and food, and greater geopolitical uncertainty. Okay, we'll stop at this slide. So this slide shows how Palau is different, and I highlighted in bold there the horizontal line for Palau. The first column is supposed to be distance to markets in kilometers, and for all the countries, you can see that it's the orange column. I think it shows up. Yeah, the orange column shows you those countries where this is a big challenge, and for all the small or the big ocean countries, remoteness is a big challenge. Palau is 11,000 plus kilometers from the nearest large market. So you're not going to get development like you would see in Vietnam or some of the other countries that are close to huge markets. You're not going to get the Asian tiger type of development model applied to Palau. It's got to be more tailored, more suited for Palau's size, and that's true of the other small countries as well. And then smallness is the second column, and the blue represents medium-sized countries in the Pacific. The orange are very small countries, and the green is the moderately sized countries. So Palau is one of the 4 relatively small countries with 18,000 inhabitants. The largest country in the PIC 9 that we have here is Vanuatu with about 300,000, and that determines what kind of products you can supply and the economies of scale. The third column is reliance on wage remittances. Palau has the lowest level of wage remittance coming into the country than any of the other PIC 9 countries. The highest that we have here is Tonga, followed by Samoa, which have quite a substantive number of remittances. In general, remittances, and quite surprisingly during the COVID pandemic, acted as a buffer for those countries. The fourth column is reliance on aid flows, and Palau has the lowest reliance on aid flows compared to all the PIC9 countries. That compares to Tuvalu, which is about 92% of GDP is represented by aid flows. So there's a substantial difference between countries in terms of dependence on aid flows. The fifth column is the Human Capital Index. It's an index that was created in the World Bank that is designed to combine educational factors, educational achievement and quality outcomes, with health outcomes. And Palau does relatively well on that index compared to the other PIC9 countries. Still, however, there's a ways to go on improving. Dependence on tourism. Here, Palau is the largest country reliant on tourism. 38% of GDP comes from tourism. The second is Vanuatu. And the column following that is dependence on fishing revenues. And you can see that Kiribati and Tuvalu are relatively highly dependent on fishing revenues, whereas Palau is only 3% of GDP is dependent on fishing revenues. And the last column is the risk of debt distress. And you can see across the Pacific, there's a high risk of debt distress, excluding Vanuatu, which is moderate. Now, this is a definition that comes from the World Bank and the IMF debt sustainability analysis. It doesn't represent that the current situation is in distress, but it represents expectations or forecasts of, under current fiscal balances, what would debt have to accumulate to be to fill those fiscal gaps. And under the current projections, if debt was used to fill those current gaps, it would go over a certain threshold. Palau, being what we call a market access country, has relatively high debt. However, it's still deemed as sustainable at the current levels, but it's at a high risk of breaching those thresholds going forward. So it's something to watch out for, as our graduate school colleagues have noted, and the IMF colleagues as well. So let's get into a little bit of the specifics about, Palau. So this graph is kind of hard to see on the screen here, but those horizontal lines, the top one there, is growth 2000 to 2009. I'm sorry, the top one is growth 10 years before COVID, and the bottom line is 2000 to 2009, 10 years before that. For most of the countries in the PIC9, which are the countries on the left, growth did increase in the early 2000s, from the early 2000s to the 2019, and that's that, go back. No, forward, I'm sorry. There, yeah, stay on the slide. So the period 2000 to 2009, growth in Palau, for example, was around 1%. Since 2010 to 2019, it went up to above 2%, or almost 2%. Nehru there, you can see growth being relatively high in the latter part of the sample, and that's primarily due to the regional processing center that is hosted by Australia. And then you can see how it compares to, on the right-hand side, the small island developing countries, that's the far right. They didn't see any growth prior to COVID compared to the previous 10 years, 2000 to 2009. The other peers, we call them structural and aspirational peers, also saw slower growth. So most of the Pacific was doing quite well prior to COVID. This graph shows what happened 5 years before COVID, the peak of the COVID impact, 2020, and what's projected going forward. And you can see here, Palau was hit the worst because of its dependence on tourism. Growth was relatively high prior to COVID, and our forecast across the region shows that it's not expected to rise above the 5 years prior to COVID, and that's due to the economic scarring, the time that it'll take to get back to the pre-COVID period. And here, this shows tourism and travel and the impact that tourism and travel has on the economy. The bars show the change in international visitor spend as a share of GDP in 2000 and its change. And the dot shows the change in tourism and travel. The dot shows the change in tourism and travel as a share of GDP, and the bars show the change in international visitor spend. And you can see the bar for Palau fell the most, and that's very much related to the change in tourism and travel. Kiribati, however, saw a drop in tourism and travel, but the spend wasn't changed that much. The share of GDP wasn't impacted that much because of its dependence also on fishing. The other blue bars show other small island countries, and they all suffered as well due to the impact of COVID, but not as much as the Pacific. Next slide. This shows the volatility, fiscal volatility in the North Pacific relative to global indicators. And you can see Palau here, as well as FSM and RMI, have a relatively low volatility on the revenue side compared to other Pacific Island countries, which are the red dots. This is a global data set, and you can see, well, I guess you can't see, but if you saw the diagram, you'd see other small dots on there. But it does have a relatively low volatility in revenues. Same thing with spending, although it is a bit more volatile on spending. And we think that's due to the constancy in the compact funds and the constancy in grants that allows Palau to mitigate external shocks. This one shows import dependency in the Pacific. And as you can see, all the countries in the Pacific rely heavily on imports. This is imports of goods and services as a share of GDP. And across the Pacific, there's a high dependency on this. It's not a bad thing, because you need imports to support tourism, you need imports to support other industries as well, and it allows for you to specialize in the areas that your comparative advantages is in. So this slide talks about how digitalization has room for improvement. And in this one, we use the example of digital technology used for trade facilitation. And Palau ranks on the lower end of the scale amongst the other Pacific countries that we cover. First of all is the light yellow bar is transparency. How much of the information on trade regulations and things like that are made available publicly, and can importers and exporters utilize that? How much of the formalities that you can fulfill in terms of digital customs forms and things like that are online and can fill out. Institutional arrangements and cooperation. Can you exchange information between countries easily, digitally? Does paperless trade exist? And can you submit documents online that with electronic signatures and the like to be able to transact? And then lastly, cross-border regulations and customs. Can you pre-submit bills of lading and things like that online digitally rather than having paper? So It's an example of the way in which digitalization and internet connectivity really supports development. Next slide. This one shows the vulnerability of the Pacific to climate and disaster risks. The left-hand slide shows, the red line shows the moving average, 3-year moving average of natural disasters occurring in the Pacific, and that's been going up. But there is quite a bit of volatility from year to year. The blue bars on the left show the number of incidents that have occurred. On the right table, what you can see is the average cost or losses due to disasters as a percentage of GDP. And Palau is relatively high in average annual losses of in GDP due to natural disasters. The cost per annual event is quite high as well, $1,200. But the loss of life is less in Palau, probably because the number of people are lower, but also the infrastructure might be a bit better. Now, on the health side, the name of the game in many of the countries in the Pacific is how to address the challenges of non-communicable diseases. The left side shows obesity increasing over time between 2000 and 2016 for many of the countries in the Pacific. All the countries in the Pacific have seen obesity increase, and that's highly related to the right graph, which is diabetes, which is a major problem. In fact, for Palau, it's one of the countries that has seen one of the largest increases in diabetes. So, given all these challenges, you could theoretically come up with a Christmas tree of to-dos. And what we try to do is narrow that down. And this is the criteria that we use for, next slide, the criteria that we use for development priorities. Number one, does it have an impact on the twin goals that the World Bank is most concerned about? That is poverty reduction and increasing growth of the bottom 40% of the income distribution. So is it improving the welfare of those that are most vulnerable in the countries? That's the overriding one. So does a certain priority have an impact on those individuals? Secondly, does a priority have connections to other development priorities? Are there spillovers? And yesterday we heard about the digital economy and the importance of that. That's one of those priorities that will have a spillover. Tourism has spillovers as well, but it maybe not as much as developing the foundations for digital connectivity. Education is important in and of itself, and there are spillovers there. So there's no priority that's unique and important in and of itself, but it can have influence on others as well. Urgency under COVID, disaster risk, and climate change. As I noted earlier, these are all emerging factors and becoming increasingly pertinent to longer and term sustainable growth. And so are there anything that you can do today that will help longer term growth? The time horizon of the priority also is important. Things that can be done quickly might be done first because of the immediate benefits. Secondly, on the bottom in the middle, the second row, second column, evidence base. What type of evidence do we have? And third, feasibility. How easy is it for the government to impact or implement? Next slide. So we divide up the SCD into 3 different pathways. I'll have slides here for each one of the pathways. This is increased economic opportunities. And we have development priorities that are shown on the left-hand side, which revitalize and realize sustainable tourism, expanding opportunities for oceanic fishing, enhance labor mobility opportunities, improve digital connectivity and services in the private and public sectors. For Palau, I highlighted in orange the highest priority in that, and that is revitalizing tourism after COVID-19 is critical, and is particularly, one of the most important contributors to growth going forward. Of course, it's not the only contributor to growth, but kickstarting that will help trickle down into other sectors. The next two are potential for increased revenue base as tourism has slowed. That's expanding opportunities in oceanic fishing. There is some revenue there that can be extracted, so that is something that Palau might want to think about. And then the enhanced labor mobilities, that's a modest, moderate level of importance. And lastly, fixed band internet connectivity. Fixed band internet is not well connected in Palau, but it is an important thing to pursue right now. Okay, next slide. The second pathway is maximizing human capital and its economic returns. So two of the categories are moderate, not so important, and one is medium. And the medium one is strengthen health systems in the middle to improve coverage and resilience, and that's related to the non-communicable diseases. The top one is education and access to secondary higher education. It's important, but it's less so than other Pacific Island countries. But that is related to improving educational outcomes and quality. Quality is a big challenge. It's not just about students attending school, but what do they learn? And lastly, at the very bottom, is increased women's paid employment and reduced gender-based violence. In many of the Pacific Islands, this is a challenge, but in Palau, it's relatively low compared to the rest of the Pacific. The third pathway, next slide, is resilient incomes and livelihoods. And as you can see there, all these are medium levels of priorities, except for agriculture, which has a modest ability to contribute to growth, although it can through the tourism sector. The first one is strengthen climate and disaster risk policies and build resilient systems. And that would be related to heightened awareness of climate change and disaster risks and building resilient systems to adapt. The second one is developing adaptive social protection systems. So what is adaptive social protection systems? Well, it's not just blanket coverage that's automatically given to every individual, but expands during downturns and then contracts during upturns, or that to mitigate the boom-bust cycle that was discussed earlier. You increase social protection at a time when individuals are hard hit, and then you withdraw it for savings at later dates when there is another cycle. And lastly, strengthen resilient agriculture and fisheries for small-scale farmers. Again, coastal fisheries has some potential benefit. So does agriculture, but agriculture is less of a potential benefit than fisheries. And then these are the fundamental enablers. And these are related to, number one, enhance infrastructure and the investment climate to attract businesses and provide businesses that are here ability to grow and expand. These are all medium priorities. Number two, improve public revenue and expenditure management. I guess from what we heard from the graduate school, perhaps that should be a high priority now. This is basically, are you tracking revenue and expenditure and allocating it to those sectors that would give you the biggest bang for the buck? The third one is ensure macroeconomic, fiscal, and debt sustainability. That's a medium. Maybe that should be a high priority as well. However, compared to the rest of the Pacific, Palau is not doing as bad as some others. The last one, which is explore technologies to fill data and knowledge gaps. This is an area that has been particularly important across the Pacific. And that is, the Pacific has typically been described as a data desert. So improving data indicators, knowing where the poor and the vulnerable live, what are their challenges, how economic activity moves back and forth, what sectors are expanding and contracting, can really help researchers like the World Bank, the ADB, the U.S. Government school, graduate school, can do these studies much more easily and frequently. And it would also allow international researchers to provide advice and knowledge that could help Palau. So we at the World Bank are starting up this, what we call Pacific Data Observatory. And that's designed to use traditional as well as non-traditional data, such as satellite imagery, to map out where economic activity is growing. And we hope that will supplement traditional data systems. Finally, next slide, the last slide. So I'd love to get your feedback on these development priorities. Number one, do the development priorities outlined in this SCD document reflect what you see as important priorities for Palau? What should receive more attention? Are there areas that we may have missed in the systematic country diagnostic? It would be great to hear from you. And lastly, how has the current global context impacted these development priorities? We try to feed that in, but perhaps we're not catching things. So we'd love to hear back from you, either now or during the break. So open it up for questions. Anybody that would like to, thank you. A microphone is coming.
David, thanks again. Yesterday I mentioned the importance of a sort of framework for characterizing the economies of the Pacific in order to allow strategies for development. Yesterday I mentioned the fundamental importance of governance, good governance, formulating policies and developing institutions, which I suggested our industry development and our success as being fundamental to product and factory market, factory product market development and yield on investment. And I think we should take note that some agencies, World Bank, ADB, governments of Australia and New Zealand are indeed paying attention to these factors. But there's a second area I would suggest that needs attention, in that Palau and other Pacific Island countries are not only reliant on developing tourism, agriculture and fisheries, goods and services, but the economies of the Pacific are also somewhat dependent on international assistance, earnings from trust funds and earnings from remittances. And if you take those earnings together with fish license fees, these take the nature of rents. The countries are exporting their labor, they're exporting their capital, and in return they're importing higher costs, higher prices of labor and capital, and they're importing certain disincentives, some countries, to lessen the need for increasing domestic revenues. And this sort of latter set of incomes is significant in the Pacific, and it is a problem for domestic production. It raises the cost and such. And today, I know that at least one country, Samoa, are taking a second look at the seasonal worker scheme and what impact that is having on availability and price of labor and the cost of developing a domestic economy. So all I'm suggesting is that it would be good for all of us, I think, to take a broader look at what is the framework for investment, growth and development in all of the islands. Thanks.
Thank you. Great comment.
Delegate Talep po. Ate Lewin. David, I think one of the data that I would probably like to have been highlighted is looking at the tax to GDP ratio. And in some of your World Bank's data, it's actually shown, and Palau right now is at 18%. United States is about 25%. This is the tax to GDP ratio.
Okay.
So, for instance, if you're looking at a 300 million GDP for Palau, if you're looking at 20%, that's $60 million. You're supposed to capture $60 million of that. Well, US is right now is at 25%. If you look at the successful countries in Europe, which we don't tend to use that as an example, we're looking at like 40%. But you need to capture as much as possible in terms of taxes from your GDP to fund a lot of the programs like infrastructure, health, because right now, if you look at Palau, there's a lot of money going around, it's just not going to the government. I don't know where it is going. It's $300 million. That's $300 million. There's how many banks here in Palau? 3 FDIC banks. That should tell you something. That there's a lot of money in Palau, that people are putting their money in the bank and they're taking their money and they're investing it in the US stock market. If you go to FSM, there's only one Bank of Guam. In Palau, we have 3 US banks. If you go to the Marshalls, only one bank. So I think I would like to see more of some of the recommendations that really look into that, and I don't think it's brain surgery. So I appreciate getting into the nitty-gritty of what really can we do. If you think we're not capturing the right amount of taxes, I would appreciate if you can tell us, like, look, there's just a lot of money that's not being captured in Palau. Thank you. But
Yeah.
by the way, I really liked your presentation, and it's there's a lot of data there that I was really interested in knowing.
There's a lot of data in the presentation. There's a lot more in the report. The report is about 150 pages long. But your point on tax mobilization is important, and we do go into it in a bit of detail in the report and how to build that greater tax revenue base. I think it is a critical point, and I think you articulated it well. One of the areas that that we do look at is the public financial management, making sure that not only the revenues are adequate, but they're spent in the areas that need to be spent in and highlighted. Expanding the tax base. It sounds like the VAT, which will be coming in January, is one of the areas that you can, expand the tax base. But also, you're absolutely right. How to expand it is really important. 18% is not terrible. I've seen worse, but it could be much better. It's something closer to 20%, 25% would be big.
Senator man saurang will question kwati wabang kemek lutul lo si iatratoy. David, the gentleman behind me was talking about remittances, and the way I heard the discussion based on your slide, Palau relies also on was something and remittances based on one of your presentation slide, and this caught my attention. For Palau, because of small population, one of the resilient industry is construction, is measured by our revenue generated. And construction relies heavily on foreign labor. Foreign labor employees remit their salaries to their family. So maybe, and I haven't seen it as a concept, will it be a problem or something that we can work with? But Palau currently have a remittance tax. And part of that tax, if you look at the numbers, over 300,000 goes to civil service pension plan as part of the remittance tax. But that's as far as remittance is concerned. So per your slide and maybe recommendations, would that be something to look into as far as rather than sending the remittance out, is it possible to keep it in and let it circulate in the domestic market? So just a question, food for thought, and if you have any recommendations, I think it's very appreciated. Thank you.
No, that's a very interesting point. So, for the Pacific, we always look at remittances coming in. Yeah. Rarely do we look at, remittances going out. Yeah. But the foreign workers do play an important role in the economy. I think if you, and certainly taxing them at a rate that is equivalent to domestic labor is appropriate. And also utilizing those funds in a way that can support your local development strategies, that's critical. The challenge is a balancing one, because if you tax the outflows of remittances, you're going to have to pay the workers more as well. So that will be incorporated into a higher wage structure. I'm not saying that's bad, but it's just it's a consequence of that. But it is, I think, something that the government really should consider as well, taking a look at that closely. Thank you. Yeah.
David, I heard you said next year you're planning to also expand the tax system. What we need now is, I think we need to utilize more of our domestic natural resources to use to supplement what this so-called increasing the tax or the coming of the slow recovery of the tourist industry and others, because it's going to take a while. And Palau have obligations to its people. And so I think this meeting, we can come up with how are we going to use our natural resources to supplement the need of the Palauans. Thank you.
No, that's a very good point. I think it relates to a larger question, not only relevant for Palau, but during this time of uncertainty, is this, how do you manage, mitigating the impact of higher prices due to the current spike in inflation on the poor and the lack of tourism on the poor. How do you mitigate that with fiscal revenues and programs, but at the same time keep a lid on the budget deficit and keep the fiscal system sustainable? So it's an important trade-off. You've got to do both, and certainly grants can help that from development partners. But at the same time, you have to be very cognizant and utilize the resources that you have now very wisely. Now, your point about are there other natural resources that Palau can use to supplement revenues and provide economic activity, I think that's a very good point, and one that Palau should pursue. I think maximizing all sorts of economic activities, being cognizant that you don't want to maximize one activity at the expense of the other. So I was having a discussion the other day about the trade-off between expanding fishing and tourism. Obviously, you don't want to expand tourism, expanding fishing at the expense of keeping the sustainable tourism and the eco-friendly tourist markets available to you. Likewise, whether it's mining or agriculture, you don't want to destroy the natural resources at the expense of other activities that could be here. That said, there's some other activities that I know it's on the government agenda, expanding digital connectivity and the digital transformation. That can build the economy with less impacts on other sectors that might dampen growth. So I think you're right. Utilizing natural resources where available and don't have such a large trade-off in terms of one expanding at the expense of the other, those are the sectors that should be looked at. So that's a very good point. Anybody else?
Thank you, David, for that wonderful presentation. Regarding something that's not really been talked about much at this throughout the economic symposium, is when you look at other Pacific islands, especially the island of Fiji, and what they've done with their yachting tourism. This is something I feel, in September of 2019, Palau passed the yacht fee bill, which increased the arrival fees for especially sailing boats into the Republic at a serious exponential rate that basically took that future revenue or possible revenue for the Republic and did away with it for the most part. I still see some sailboats arriving, and there is a bit of a protocol that has to be followed through the through the port directives regarding yachts arriving into Palau. But at the end of the day, I guess it's just something that I feel like the Congress of Palau, the OEK, should look into once again and try to see if this is a way to generate additional revenue regarding super yachts. It has no impact. They're willing and able to come, and hopefully that's something that Palau could hopefully attract more of, just because the spending amounts on super yachts is quite extreme. But getting back to sailboats, it's just sad to see that this yacht fee law that's now put in place since 2019 has basically deterred multitudes of yachts from coming to Palau. And if maybe you could just enlighten the audience a bit about, I'm not sure if what you may know about the Fiji yachting tourism. I know it's quite significant, and even after they were prepared to, during the pandemic, they had set up some blue something. I can't remember. It was blue something regarding yachts coming into Palau and the easement of that.
Blue lane. A blue lane.
A blue lane. That's correct. I would just hope that we can convince Congress to amend the yacht fee law to allow for yachts to come back into Palau. I think it's a significant revenue for the tourism industry. It's revenue for both our retail and especially on hardwares and just food products and whatnot, and resupplies, and then just also has the ability to generate revenue for because they do pay the PPEF fee and as well as whatever arrival fees that could be implemented, but just moving those away from extreme to a lesser, more acceptable fee. I'm not sure why this fee was put in place. It seems to have deter multitudes of yachts from coming here, and I hope that that can be reconsidered and hopefully adjusted to be more acceptable to the yachting side of the tourism industry. Thank you.
Thank you. I didn't know about this, and so you're educating me. Sounds reasonable. I guess the only thing I would note is, you want to be competitive in the region. And so when you're looking at taxes on visitation and on other tourist activities, you don't want it to be too high, and you don't want it to be too low, because you miss out the revenues. Too high, you deter tourism, and too low, you're missing out. So I guess looking around the region and what your competitors are doing and pricing the taxing accordingly would be the best activity. So, I mean, if Fiji is the main competitor to Palau, then yeah, I would definitely try to price it the same amount. Anybody else? Okay, thank you very much.